Revelation chapter 13, Revelation 13, 1 and 2. Now you think in all of that time that given announcements and different things, I would have been ready and in the right spot, but I wouldn't. All right, Revelation chapter 13, 1 and 2. We've been here for a little while. It says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." All right, well, we ended last week in Daniel chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. If we get the next slide, I think you see that that's there as far as our stopping point. There it is. All right, and that whole thing ends with the Antichrist thinking to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time 1 and times 2 in the dividing of time, which is a half, which gives you 3.5. And you'll see that show up. Now, where did you read that before? In Revelation chapter 12, you read where a time and times and half a time was the length of time Israel was fed in the wilderness from the face of the serpent, 3.5 years. It's an amazing thing as you get back into that stuff of Exodus and their time in the wilderness and what the Lord did there, that it's an allegory and a picture, although it may be in the past, is that it is a clear indication of what is to come. What was old will be new again. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 26 and 28, that's what we'll start here this evening. I'll give you a little bit of time to get there. Daniel chapter 7, verses 26 to 28. This 3.5 years. Daniel chapter 7, verses 26 through 28. It says, "But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. Keeping in mind that the lion represents England of a sort, the bear represents Russia, and the leopard represents the United States, we'll take that back to Revelation chapter 13 and see again in verse 2. "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, feet of a bear, and his mouth the mouth of a lion. And then you have a dragon which gives him his power and his seat and great authority." And you can read future history the way a lot of scholars were never able to read it. And that's certainly true for the most part of no matter what you kind of listen to out there. I'll happen across clips of different people, whether it's a YouTube video or something like that, and somebody will bring up Nephilim or something that's kind of, interesting revelation associated. And I'll say, well, I wonder if they got it right or not. And they almost always end up, like, we got some wild thing in Revelation, and I'm going to show it to you. And they'll end up saying the exact same thing because they all learn it from the same places. They don't really study the Bible. They just repeat. They don't compare Scripture with Scripture. All right? But what you got here is you can read future history the way a lot of these folks can't read it. In Revelation chapter 13, 2, it says, "The beast which I saw was like unto a leopard." The final world kingdom is like the United States. It's spotted, it's integrated, there's no distinct nationality. You're finding that more and more inside the United States with the more porous your borders become and the more of you get an influx of immigrants coming from all over the world and all of these kinds of different countries. It's not the same as it was in your early 1900s or even in the 1940s, 1950s, where somebody was trying to get to America to get a better life. And so whenever they got here, your first generation immigrants would say, here, what we're going to do is we're only going to speak English because we want you to be Americans. They would assimilate into the American society because, listen, America was a great country to be a part of, and if they wanted to basically associate with that greatness, they would become Americans. You don't have that anymore. That's not what people are doing as they come here. I see it a lot, where somebody will immigrate here and the flag that's hanging from their rearview mirror is not an American flag, it's the Portuguese flag, or it's the Honduran flag, or it's a whatever flag. They're still flying the flag of the country where they came from. They're not coming here to be Americans. They're coming here for the better life, but not to be an American. So what you're seeing is what's happened in America is that it has no distinct nationality anymore. And I'm not necessarily just trying to be hard on those people. It's just that the goal is not there anymore. You would understand if you lived in the country where those people came from, their desire to come here. I get that. Okay? But we're looking at things from a end of the world perspective. If you have something like the United States is no longer distinctly American. You look at any product that you buy, you won't find, likely, just one language on it. You'll find at minimum two, even whenever we had our VBS here and we had caution tape out. I thought it was, alluding to the upcoming Father's Day because it said caution, see you, Dad. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the pity. Dad, see, Dad jokes. Yeah, no, Spanish for caution. And so you can't hardly find anything that doesn't, I think the battle right now is what America even is. See, how America started out, it was a constitutional republic. That's what it's supposed to be. But now it is I'm trying to think of what the term for it is. It's what they want it to be is a multicultural democracy. That's the new term, is multicultural democracy. So it's a homogeneous, integrated, indistinct conglomeration. So whenever you get to this last kingdom, now honestly you go anywhere in the world and that's not just an American trait. It's becoming that way. If you were to go to France today, you would see much the same thing. There's a huge Arabic population in France. You would find that all throughout Europe at this point because that's who they share borders with. If you go to Dearborn, Michigan, you're going to hear probably in the streets the Islam call to prayer, right? In Michigan, right? Would you have imagined that, in the 1950s in Michigan that, that was America. You go to Detroit, that was one of the up-and-coming cities, one of your major cities in the United States. Now you go up into your Rust Belt, and it looks like it's been bombed out in a lot of those places. And so it's not just America, but you're getting into a world that has no distinct nationality left in it. It's mixed. It's Asiatic, African, European melting pot with European on the bottom as the leopard has a white belly. It's Asiatic all over, and it's spotted with Africa. And his feet were the feet of a bear. This thing speaks English, but it moves like a bear. And Russia has the greatest infantry in the world. The only part of it that is like Russia is its feet, how it moves. So it moves like Russia. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know, other than it says that it's got the feet of a bear. So if the bear is Russia, and I say that with an if, because you can get to the end of this thing and find out that maybe it's not Russia at all, but it looks like Russia. It may not be America at all, but it looks like America. It may not be England at all, but it looks like England. It looks like English, even as far-reaching as Spanish and Mandarin are, the language of business is still English. All right, let's see. So it's like the United States, but it operates like communist Russia. Well, you're starting to see that a lot more now. Right? You're starting to see less and less of a republic in the United States and more of a communist United States. And again, because the Bible is not about America, what you should see is that all over the world, or it growing all over the world. And it is. More and more of the world is becoming more and more communistic. Okay? And his mouth is the mouth of a lion. He speaks. Revelation chapter 13. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. It says, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his, notice this, mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell therein. All right, so the beast speaks, and he's got the mouth of a lion. So if the lion is England, then it's likely that when he speaks, he's speaking English. All right, at least as a possibility. So he's an English-speaking beast. His mouth is the only part of him that is like England, which is reasonable in the fact that the impact that England has had is mostly its language at this point. Now, at one point, whenever England had the King James Bible, the kingdom of England spread all over the world. And that's actually what you see as the gospel traveled from east to west, is that whatever country was the dominant force behind putting the gospel out prospered the most. So before it was England, it was Spain. Because you even had Paul. Paul traveled to Spain. And so for a long time, Spain was really putting the gospel out. Whenever they stopped putting the gospel out, right? In fact, before England was a power, it was Spain. Spain was sending people all over the world, right? But as they became Catholic, right, you'll find things in Spanish history that you could not call coincidence. You'll hear in social studies to this day something referred to as the Spanish Armada. In a time whenever they were at war with England, when England started to get the King James Bible, you know what happened? The Spanish Armada was taken out by a hurricane, almost completely wiped out. And you know who picks up and starts things like the East India Company and starts putting colonies in India, Africa, and in the United States? It's not Spain anymore, it's England. And then as England becomes Anglican, what country do you see popping up on the scene seemingly out of nowhere? The United States. And the United States, from 1700 to 1900, let's say 1980, was the dominant power in the world, was the dominant power. I don't think that you could call the United States the dominant power in the world today. Why? What's always the catalyst behind this? The rise and the fall are always seem to be associated with the same thing, the book. What do you do with the book? When Spain had the book, they prospered. When Spain gave up the book, they declined. When England picked up the book, they prospered. When England gave up the book, they declined. When America picked up the book, they prospered, and in 1900, they gave up the book and began a decline. And you're pretty close to the end of that. I mean, you're seeing the fruits, the absolute destruction of that decline. It's amazing to me, and if I was to tell you countries to watch out for prospering, they would be countries that you would not expect. I would say look for countries like, what am I thinking of? Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. What's that? Fiji. The South Pacific island nations. You say, why them? Well, at least a couple of those South Pacific island nations have came out and really elevated your King James Bible. It's been some years ago, but Papua New Guinea started a project to get not just any Bible, but to get the King James Bible into the hands of every elementary, middle school, and high school student in the country. And we supported that. We sent money over there. Right? I don't know if this church did at that time, but I know that we did when we were out at West Liberty. In that time, Fiji has, I believe maybe Fiji beat them to that, in that as far as a goal. But if I was to look at countries to prosper, I'd look at Papua New Guinea and Fiji. Just saying. All right? Let's see. So his mouth is the only part of him that's England. That means that the universal language at the second coming of Christ is going to be English. To say it doesn't look like it's going that way right now. Well, all I can tell you is the way that it looks by the time the tribulation comes around. It's amazing what kinds of things can turn or hinge and cause it to suddenly shift a certain way. It could be something as simple as there's a new computer software that comes out that completely trumps everything else that's out there, but there's one catch: it's in English only. In which case, every computer system in the world would have to adopt this English or fall behind and become obsolete. And if you're going to operate under that system and use that equipment and use all this technological advancements, I think one of the things that you'll see, especially as you get closer to the tribulation, is that the way technology goes is the way society will go. You know, and you see a huge shift in just how people think, what their opinions are, based upon the media that they absorb, is based upon the social media that they absorb, and that social media that they're absorbing is based upon technology. So I think it could be a quick shift just like that. Hey, here's a new platform that's coming out. Here's the catch. It's in English. And then suddenly you see, listen, if you want to ride the train, you're going to have to learn English. It could be as simple as that. I don't know. I think as you get closer to the tribulation, things are going to move so quickly and in such a different way that it will, in some instances, be something that from where you sit right now, you would not have seen coming. Just because the world is moving that fast. It's moving incredibly fast. All right. So to get the Protestants into the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope will put the Mass into English. And from what I can see, from my observation, it's not going to be that hard to bring Protestants back into the Catholic Church. Now, we've gone over this before, but this is how this stuff goes, okay? In order to, when you had the Protestants leave the Catholic Church, by the way, you as Baptists, your heritage and lineage is not Protestant, okay? Protestants came out of the Catholic Church. Now, you as an individual may come out of the Catholic Church, or individual Baptists may have come out of the Catholic Church, but Baptist as a denomination did not come out of the Catholic Church. They were never in it, okay? And we could get into Baptist history and Anabaptists and Waldensians and Paulicians and Bogomiles and Henoraceans and Goths and Visigoths and all of those kinds of things. As far back as you can find in church history, there's always been a group of Bible believers that believed that baptism had nothing to do with salvation. Okay? Which would be, you would have Bible believers, and that would be the original hallmark. If you know where you want to go back to, is go back to find somebody that believed the Bible, that did not believe that baptism could save you. And what you had right there was an early Baptist. They didn't go by the name Baptist. They went by all of those different names that I told you, and those names were used against them. They were used to delegitimize them. They were used by the Catholic Church to delegitimize those groups, because if you use a name like Hussites, what that indicates is that this is not a legitimate group. This is a group of cultists that are following John Huss. Therefore, they're illegitimate. They're fake news. And we'll make you believe that because we'll call them Hussites. And that's Paulicians and Waldensians. And, you know, Waldensians were called Waldensians because they followed Peter Waldo. But what did Peter Waldo teach? Believe the Bible, baptism can't save you. Okay? New Testament salvation has always been a hallmark. Now, whenever it comes to the tribulation, you're going to have the Pope get a bunch of Protestants to come back into the Catholic Church. That's not that hard to do because a lot of your Protestants never went that far from the Catholic Church to begin with. They still believe that baptism saves you. They may worship in a totally different way, but any denomination that teaches salvation through baptism is at its heart Catholic. That's a hallmark of the Catholic Church, is salvation through baptismal regeneration. They may have a different name on the door, and they may have praise and worship music and all of the other things that go along with quote-unquote evangelical churches, but their root doctrine is Catholic. Go ahead.
I know Catholics sprinkle, I know
in essence, they're accomplishing the same thing. They're saying that this is being done by water. But it is a little silly that they sprinkle instead of dunk, because the word baptism literally means to dunk, plunge, totally submerge. So there ought to be a completely, totally different word for sprinkle, right? Because it's not, by definition, it's not a baptism, but they are going to call it that. So obviously, by the time you get here and you're trying to bring these groups, say your Christian church that believes that baptism saves you, right? In order to bring them in, there's going to have to be some sort of compromise on that. But your bigger compromises are going to come between them and, let's say, Islam. But they're already trying to do that, right? You've already had the Pope say back in probably 2010 that it was completely legitimate to refer to God as Allah. That's already happened. Why? Because we're trying to stretch that olive branch out, and whether or not the Pope at the time understood that or not, is that all things are leading to this. It's all moving towards this, just like gravity. It's an irresistible force they cannot resist, but to fall in line with what this book says is going to happen. Now, the job of the individual then is to do what this book says and get saved and prevent yourself from that fate. So, but to get back to my earlier point, though, is that not only did a lot of your Protestants never move that far from the Catholic Church, but at least whenever they did leave the Catholic Church, they left the Catholic Church on scriptural grounds. They had scriptural reasons for leaving or being upset with the Catholic Church, which is why they left. You had, like, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Thesis to Westminster Abbey, and here are my scriptural reasons for why the Catholic Church is wrong. But to this day, the Lutherans still believe in baptismal if I'm not mistaken, still believe in baptismal regeneration. You saved, or baptism is a major part of that. And a lot of the other ways in which they do their services are still very similar. But even aside from that, how else would you start to get them back in? Well, that process started in 1901, whenever we're going to start putting out new Bible versions. Now, the RSV, whenever it came out, was an exclusively Catholic text. It was the Catholic Bible. So your options were the King James Version or the RSV, essentially. And what you had in 1901 was the adoption of what was called the ASV, the American Standard Version. And it was a Catholic text. It took the same text as the RSV and updated it, modernized it, homogenized it. And then since 1901, you have over 200 different Bible versions that all use the same text as the RSV Catholic Bible. And the changes that are in those Bibles all line up with the RSV, not your King James Version. And then it started to get into the seminaries and the colleges and the pulpits. Because what we can get into the school system will be what people learn and prefer, and then eventually you got some ministerial student, and the guy comes in and says, you need the ASV. Nobody says it's a Catholic text. This kid's not a professing Catholic, but eventually his doctrine begins to gravitate there. He graduates school, and he ends up standing in a pulpit, preaching from an ASV, back out to a congregation of people that weren't Catholics to start with, but now they're reading or hearing read from an ASV, and they're getting a Catholic doctrine. They don't call themselves Catholics, but slowly, over time, the temperature of the water begins to change, so much so that nobody even notices it. And what you have had in the Christian church, or in Christianity today, is largely Catholic Bibles being taught from pulpits, no matter what is on the outside of the building, and the doctrine has slowly shifted to a Catholic doctrine. It's just not called Catholicism. But make no mistake, it's still Catholic. Again, if you take your doctrine for salvation back to water baptism, you're teaching a Catholic doctrine. And so the Assembly of God, it might be a little different in terms of tongues and some of those things, but your Lutherans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, even your Methodists in large extent, They're not going to have, and even your Baptists are not going to have that big of a problem, those that are not saved, of adopting and going with the Pope whenever he shows up in the tribulation and says, come back into the Catholic Church. You have so many Baptists today that whenever a Catholic stands up and says, well, you all used to be Catholics, and you left the Catholic Church, you left the universal mother church, and one of these days you're all going to come back to it. There are Baptists that believe that. Oh, well, if that's the case, then I guess it might make sense to go back to the mother church, because your doctrine has been so watered down by a watered down Bible that nobody knows anything about what that book says. They don't know why they believe what they believe. Most churches don't teach anything anyway. They just teach a la gospel. There's nothing being said. There is no doctrine. And so, although it may seem, oh, there's no way, there is no way. You could sit there and say, there's no way that all of these different denominations are going to wind up right back under the Pope. Listen, you're living in a world where outside of this room, even a lot of the people that you know down the street and across the street or down the road from you could not tell you why they believe what they believe. So if somebody stands up on television and gives a convincing answer, you think that they're strong enough in their faith to resist it? Most people still believe what Maddow says, or the talking head on television says. Well, it must be true. Anderson Cooper said it. So you think it's going to be that different if you get a well-spoken Pope that starts quoting Scripture? I agree with that, I agree with that, I agree with that. Oh, well, I can't see any reason why we shouldn't. And so because what you're going to have in the tribulation is a one-world religion. And most people will fall for it. A huge chunk of your Christians left behind because, listen, let's be honest for a second. Why did they get left behind to begin with? Right? Why would a group of Christians not get raptured out? What must that have meant? They weren't saved. Okay? Well, they were professing Christians. Why weren't they saved? They thought they were saved. They hoped that they were saved. Why didn't they go? They were trusting in something else to save them. What might they have been trusting in? What are most professing Christians who are not biblically saved believe saves them? Their baptism. Most of them believe that some form of baptism is the means of their salvation. So would it stand to reason then that your Christian population that's left behind could gather easily around the necessity for baptism, for salvation, and then follow this one guy?
I've talked to people that haven't seen for 35, 40 years. In the 70s, they got saved here, baptized. I see them 40 years later, asking if they're in church or whatever. No, but remember, I got baptized. So they don't mention anything about getting saved.
That is exactly why, at least here, even though, there's two ordinances of the church, the Lord's Supper and believer's baptism. But boy, because that's such a dominant thing where somebody gets saved and then they get baptized and you ask them 40 years later because they haven't been in church, you ask them if they're saved, they'll point back to their baptism. That's the reason sometimes we'll wait 6 months after somebody gets saved before. That's why we don't have a baptismal service that often, because we don't want somebody that got saved 2 weeks ago and then gets baptized to start to confuse the two things. Let's see, Ezra got saved, last October? Still hasn't been baptized. That's fine, he's saved, he's going to heaven. He needs to know and understand and keep the difference between when he got saved. Sit down and ask him several times, when did you get saved? This is when I got saved. When did you get saved? This is when I got saved. Eventually he'll get baptized, and hopefully the older he gets, he still distinguishes those two things from each other. But boy, those events are such powerful events that people can't distinguish between them.
He said the same thing. He said, I think we're baptized.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, and believe me, I know of Baptists out there that don't believe in baptism at all, which I would say is wrong, right? The Bible says you get saved, you get in water, right? Because it's a testimony. A testimony. It's an answer of a good conscience towards God, right? It's a show of obedience. But it's not more than that. So whenever we have baptismal services around here, I think some of you must think I'm a broken record, because if we have a baptismal service and we have some families in here that aren't in here all the time, I'm probably going to preach the same message, clarifying baptism that I preached last time we had a baptismal service. Why? Because I think it's that important to understand what something is and what it isn't, because even though it may have been beaten to death around here, it's such a misnomer, it's such a misknown thing to most of the world that's out there. They don't understand it, or they misplace it, they misrepresent it. And so that's why there's a lot of time spent around here. Why? Because I think that that's going to be a hallmark for bringing the remaining quote-unquote Christians into that one world religion, is going to be their unity around the place of baptism. And of course, it's going to be a homogenized thing, so it won't just be that, but there'll be other things being brought in order to get Islam in, to get Buddhism in, to get Hinduism in, to get the Mormons in, to get the Jehovah's Witnesses in, and it's going to be a big compromised mess, but it's going to happen, and it's going to happen under the Pope, and it's going to happen under Catholicism. It would not surprise me, as foolish, I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm seeing a lot of stuff pop back up into the news about Mormonism. It would not surprise me if there wasn't some higher up in the LDS that has some vision from God that says, the Catholic Church is the true church. And then listen, if they blindly followed a charlatan like Joseph Smith or whoever, you think they wouldn't blindly follow another charlatan right back into the Catholic Church? Absolutely they would. Absolutely they would. All right. So, we look into this stuff. That the gates of hell are going to use this church, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Go, if you will, to Matthew chapter 16. Got off on a little bit of maybe not a tangent necessarily, but look at Matthew 16.
Pastor, before we get too far away from this Revelation 13:6, which is there,
Uh-huh.
and it says, and his tabernacle, is that referring to all the churches, or is that referring to the tabernacle? It's talking about blasphemy.
That would be God's tabernacle. So if you look at that in Revelation 13:6, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, that would be God's name. And his tabernacle, that would be God's tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. So he's cursing God, he's cursing his name, he's cursing his church, and he's cursing all of those in that church. So yeah, it would not be the Antichrist or the devil's tabernacle. So we could get into some things of that, and it could be the church, or it could be Judaism itself. Because you think the tabernacle.
The church, or referring to a tabernacle, like in Israel,
Well, because of the way it is there, against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle. That's God's tabernacle. So
it's really when he
and
church and temple.
What's that?
That's not when isn't that when he sets himself up in the temple and says, I am God?
Let's see. Back in verse 4 it says, they worshiped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? Well, if he's sitting in the temple and proclaiming himself to be God, I don't think that he would be blaspheming the place where he's sitting and claiming himself to be God, necessarily. what I think is happening at that point is he's claiming himself to be God, and so anybody who's worshiping, because they're just like you had Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah and Daniel, right? There's an image that's put up, right? And every time the music plays, they're bowing down, correct? But these three boys are not bowing down, right? Picture of what's going to go on in the tribulation, right? Well, there's going to be people in the tribulation not bowing down to the Antichrist either. You're going to have 144,000 Jewish evangelists not bowing down to the image. And so at that same time, I think, that can be what he's talking about, is that he's cursing the God that those people that are not worshiping him are worshiping. And he's cursing. See, he's going to go back and say, because you got a bunch of people that say, no, Jesus Christ is God. Well, he's going to curse his name. That's the name he's going to curse. All right? And he's going to curse anybody that doesn't follow the Antichrist, including that tabernacle. So you're going to have Jews and people, Christians, and in essence, you're going to have a different gospel during the tribulation, right? You're going to have faith and works. You're going to have believe on Jesus Christ and keep his commandments in the tribulation. It's not the same as what it is in this age. And so of that church, of that body of believers, he's going to curse that church. If that makes sense. Go ahead, Jason.
Is that when the Jews will flee to the sparrow?
Yeah, you should be looking pretty close to there, and there was getting him out speaking great things, and yeah, he opened his mouth in blasphemy against them, and it was given to make war. Now, granted, because we've already run into that, what you have throughout the book of Revelation is you have event, and then you start a new chapter, and it's not chronological to necessarily what has happened. A lot of times it's, here's the flow of, here, I'll show it your way. Here's the flow of time, and now we're going to start over, and here's the flow of time. Now, sometimes they'll go, here's the flow of time, and here's an overarching view of time. And we're not going to go all through these little events that happened and took place before. We're going to talk generally about that. So as far as this happening and then those people fleeing, yes, but you'd have to go back and look at the overlap, if that makes sense. Yeah, they'll be fed with manna from heaven for 3.5 years, just like they were in the book of Exodus. Yep, all that stuff will end up coming back.
So all the people, 144,000 saved, they'll be pretty much trying to hide.
Oh yeah. And trying to survive. Yeah. And they'll be hunted, and they'll be beheaded, and yeah, it's just, there's so many different things happening. It's just like in the world today right now, right? If you wanted to destroy America, you could probably do it by just checking off a couple of boxes. Extreme inflation, right? Food shortage, gas hikes, right? Pandemic, war in Europe, porous borders, close to probably a civil war over the abortion issue, and you just keep saying you could pick any 2 or 3 of those things and probably destroy a country. And it was almost like the bottom box said, select all, right? And just like whenever you take a quiz or a test, it says, all of the above. Okay, well, I'm just going to click all of the above because usually all of the above is the right. It's almost like Joe Biden clicked all of the above, and we're going to fill out the whole, we're going to do them all, right? And so you're living in a world where it's not just gas prices, right? There's inflation, and then you go to the grocery store and your grocery bill is really high, and you want to go to Kirksville and come back and it's $70, or and then you see the news, and there's 20 different things going on in the news all at one time. You've got your Supreme Courts looking at overturning Roe v. Wade and some other things, and now there's people threatening Supreme Court justice. There's so many different things going on, and yet you're here while all of that's going on, right? Well, in the tribulation, it's the same thing. It's not like this one event happened, and we're going to respond to this one event, right? It's just like that, except exponential and multiplied by 1,000, right? You know, in terms of, and having to make a decision, not based upon one event, but based upon 50 events that are all going on, and how one event causes these other chain of events to occur. It's not going to rain on the earth for 3.5 years, right? Well, you've seen what it's like if there's, let's say, a war in Ukraine, and then gas prices shoot up. How many different decisions does that affect? How many different things does that affect, right? By the time you have farmers and truck drivers that have to pay for that fuel, your food goes up, and everything else goes up, right? I was just talking with Ed and Brenda about fireworks. I said, where do most of the fireworks come from? They said they come from China. So, okay, so I imagine a lot of stuff going on in China has affected the price. Yes, and he said, I talked to their supplier and they said, we've got fireworks sitting on cargo ships. 2 of them are still out in the Pacific. They can't get them in to unload them, right? That causes prices to go up, right? Because there's a shortage of those fireworks. And he said once they can even get into port and get unloaded, gas prices are so high that the truck driver to pay the gas to get the fireworks from the port to the place where the fireworks are getting unloaded is higher. And the guy who's selling the fireworks has to pay. He's got gas, he's got food, he's got all of these other expenses, and so what's he going to do with the fireworks? He's got to jack them up higher so he can feed his family, right? So you see how everything doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles over and over and over again, how one thing creates a cascade of problems. We'll multiply that by 1,000 in the tribulation of how 3.5 years of no rain, and probably all these other things. You've got a mark of the beast coming out. You've got the sun 7 times hotter than it's wont to be, and so on and so forth. You've got locusts coming up out of the pit, and they're terrorizing people for however many, 3.5 years or whatever that's going on. You've got a mark of the beast that you have to have in order to either be able to buy or sell the small amount of food that there is. So what do you think happens with inflation during that time globally? Through the roof. So it's just, and that's still a world that is living from the aftermath of an instantaneous event that raptured an unknown number of Christians out, some of whom might have been flying planes, others driving cars that caused wrecks. You've got probably a Christian running a nuclear power plant here or there, or a plant here or there, and then that guy goes, and so he doesn't flip the switch or turn the dial or pull the lever and causes something to go awry. And so you've got a world recovering from an absence of Christians that were in the workforce, and they're trying to fill those positions, and some of those positions, it's just, my point is this, is that the impact of all of those things happening in a short period of time, Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins couldn't have even gotten close to it. And they're, Left Behind series, and besides the fact that there's salvation in the tribulation's way off anyway. So, what was the question? So, when it comes to being able to predict, even with the scripture that we have, what the tribulation will look like, what the Bible is giving you is specific things, but you've got a whole world that's grappling with this, right? I imagine with all of that, you do have a shortage of things like bullets. So is it any wonder in the tribulation that they're using swords? Even though they have advanced technology for things like maybe microchips or nanotechnology or Neuralink or all those other things. They've got satellites in the sky and all that, but there's a shortage of bullets. So, and you've got, like I said, you've got some guy running whatever plant that you need to process oil into gasoline, and now there's a shortage of gas. Well, what are you going to do when there's shortage on gas? Well, I guess eventually you're going to be bumming a ride from your Amish friend down the street, and you're going to be in reverse mode where, yeah, you went from giving the Amish a ride to their job site, and now you're getting a ride from the Amish to your job site. And you're back on horse, and you're going to defend yourself with a sword. Even though you've got a bioelectric chip in your hand or forehead. That's the kind of weird world that's going to exist in the tribulation. You'll have cell phones where you can watch what's going on and what the Antichrist is saying, either from your Neuralink chip that's in your head that's getting low latency downloads from the constellation series of satellites in the sky that are going overhead, and so you're seeing it right as it's happening because it's going straight into your eyeballs. But at the same time, you're going to defend yourself from the gang down the street with your samurai sword. I don't know. It's a weird world, isn't it? So to say this is what it's going to look like, what's the amount of time that gas is good for? It's not very long, is it? 6 months? Yeah. So, gotcha. But let's say the tribulation is just 3.5 years. Is it foreseeable that by the time you get to the Battle of Armageddon, it's going to be a bunch of people on foot and horseback? Because even with what gas you have, it may last long enough, but there won't be enough of it. Especially if you spend part of there in that time having World War III, and you're feeding all your tanks and artillery and all that kind of stuff. Well, that burns through it pretty quick. All right, I've spent enough time on there. Did I even read? Let me read this one verse here, and then we better get to the prayer room. Matthew 16:16. Matthew 16:16. Through verse 18, it says, "And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto thee, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." You know that you can't get non-Catholics to understand that passage is not referring to Peter. The people that know that that's not Peter is such a small group of people that's what I'm telling you, that by the time the rapture has happened, the quote-unquote Christians that have enough Bible knowledge to understand that the Pope is wrong is going to be an extremely small group of people. Because even your Baptist of today could not explain to you, most of them could not explain that to you. That what Christ is saying, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. In fact, I wish I had my list with you. I think it's probably been 4 years ago, because that's about how long we've been going through the book of Revelation. But I gave you a list of verses throughout the Old and New Testament of every time that God is referred to as the rock. And I filtered out all the times where a rock was just a rock, right? Even in the New Testament, and if somebody's got this reference, give it to me, where it says, and that rock was Jesus. Let me see if I can find it real quick, because it's pertinent, and I'd rather have it on the record here. Let's see. It's embarrassing. All right. Yeah, I believe so. 1 Corinthians, what do you say? 1 Corinthians, let's see. 10:4. 1 Corinthians 10:4. And did all drink that same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock. Notice capital R. Okay? That followed them, and that rock was Christ. Okay? Let's see. Jesus Christ, granted, we go through the whole thing, but won't reiterate that entire Bible study. But, again, along with baptism, this misunderstanding of baptism, then you can throw in Matthew 16:18 to a bunch of, again, Christians in name only, and bring them to this passage, and the world at large is so scripturally illiterate that they won't have an argument for that, and it will be one more thing that the Pope uses to bring those denominations back under Catholicism. So if you doubt that can happen, I hope that you're saved and you can watch it from heaven. Otherwise, you may live long enough to unfortunately see it from the ground. You don't want to see it from the ground, folks. You don't want to see it from the ground. All right, let's close right there.